Hi there. My name is Chloe, and on my 18th birthday, my adoptive parents handed me what they called a gift. They said I owed them my body. I had to be a surrogate for their biological daughter. Can you imagine the room falling silent as I smiled, while inside, I was burning with disbelief? Years of manipulation, favoritism, and secrets had built up, and suddenly, I realized I had the power to turn every hidden truth into my advantage. But how far would I go to expose them, and what would they do when the secrets I uncovered started unraveling everything they thought they controlled? Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, but the moment I stepped through the door, I felt the weight of the family's expectations press down like a physical force. The grand chandelier glittered over the polished hardwood floors of our Houston home, reflecting the soft glow of candles and the shimmer of my father's meticulously curated decor. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with the faint aroma of expensive perfume worn by the guests, a combination meant to impress and intimidate simultaneously. I adjusted the strap of my dress, a pale lavender hue that felt almost invisible against the sea of opulent gowns, and reminded myself to breathe. I, Chloe, the youngest adopted daughter of this family, was supposed to feel celebrated tonight. 18 years. A milestone. But as I navigated through clusters of well-dressed neighbors and distant relatives, the air was thick with unspoken judgments. Everyone's smiles seemed rehearsed, a little too tight, their eyes flitting toward my parents with that smug recognition of privilege. I kept my own expression neutral, a practice mask I had perfected over years of subtle erasures. The initial murmur of congratulations was a blur. "Happy birthday, Chloe," people said, their words sliding over me like water over stone. I smiled politely, nodding, filing each interaction away as data for later. Each compliment, each perfunctory hug, each clink of a champagne glass against another, it was all part of the tableau I had learned to observe without being absorbed. My parents, Richard and Madeline, floated through the crowd, the perfect hosts in their tailored attire, projecting warmth that didn't reach their eyes when they met mine. And then came the announcement, a simple prelude from my mother's smooth, rehearsed voice. "Chloe, sweetheart, we have a very special gift for you tonight." The room hushed, a tangible pause, a collective inhale. I smiled, curious but cautious, expecting a shiny bracelet or a gift card, something superficial. Instead, the words that fell next crushed me in an instant. "We'd like you to be a surrogate for your sister, Celine. You owe this family your body." I felt my throat constrict. My mind raced through disbelief, shock, a pulse of anger that I had to suppress instantly. My hands clenched briefly at my sides. I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks, the sting of humiliation pressing into my chest. Yet outwardly, I maintained my calm, the faintest tilt of a smile playing on my lips, concealing the storm within. I was aware of the eyes on me, the smirks of my sister Celine, the tight-lipped approval of family friends, and I let a small pause stretch, letting the weight of the moment settle heavily in the room. As the seconds crawled, I began my mental survey. Celine's posture was perfect, feigned innocence framing her calculating gaze. She leaned slightly toward our parents, a silent signal of alignment, of complicity. Guests murmured polite, oblivious congratulations, some raising glasses, others leaning in to whisper questions I didn't respond to. I cataloged each glance, each tiny gesture of disdain or entitlement. Every piece was a clue, a small building block in the strategy one would craft for later. I felt the surge of internal calculation, the frozen moment of anger transforming into an analytical calm. My mind raced through every family document I had ever glimpsed, every overheard conversation, every hidden photograph. There were patterns, subtle but persistent, little proofs of manipulation and favoritism, evidence my parents had hoped to keep buried. And tonight it would all be relevant. Yet amidst the shock and the brewing storm of resentment, I reached for my anchor. Jackson. My confidant, my friend, the one who had always been a moral compass in the labyrinth of this family's intricate manipulations. I recalled his advice after last summer's tense family dinner. "You are more than what they demand. Never forget that." His words ignited a flicker of hope within me, a small ember against the chill of betrayal. This thought became my lodestar, reminder that even in the face of coercion, I had agency. I let my eyes drift to the evidence of prior schemes laid subtly around the room, an old ledger left open on the buffet table, a photograph of my sister in a staged act of charity I had orchestrated years before, now framed to make her look magnanimous. These reminders were sharp, almost painful, but they fueled the determination that had been simmering in me for years. Each document, each carefully posed photo, each insincere display of virtue would be weaponized in time. As my parents pressed for an immediate response, their hands lightly brushing mine as if to coax agreement, the room seemed to constrict. Silence became a heavy curtain. I maintained my calm, an unreadable expression masking every surge of emotion within. A faint smile curved my lips, not of joy, but of quiet defiance. I would not comply tonight. I would not react in a way that granted them the satisfaction of control. Instead, I smiled, letting the silence stretch long enough for the weight of their audacity to become almost unbearable. I noticed subtle tremors in the posture of some guests, tiny shifts in their weight, as if they could sense the tension under my controlled exterior. My sister, Celine, bit her lower lip, a barely perceptible twitch, and I catalogued that too. Every detail mattered. Every reaction was a piece of the puzzle. This would all come together, eventually, and the revelation of their secrets would be both precise and devastating. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, a metronome marking my collected heartbeat, a rhythm grounding me amidst the whirl of humiliation and suppressed rage. I reminded myself that my strategy did not need to be impulsive. Patience had always been my greatest weapon. Tonight, I would plant the seeds of awareness in everyone present, and over time, their carefully constructed illusions would unravel. As I moved through the room, accepting the empty congratulations and the polite nods, I made mental notes of the layout, the positioning of my parents and sister, the placement of cameras and attentive staff. Every detail would be leveraged later. I remembered the hidden ledger tucked in my father's study, the emails I had discreetly saved, and the financial documents subtly proving my contributions to family assets, all overlooked by those who assumed my silence was submission. When my mother placed a hand lightly on my shoulder, the insistence in her touch a subtle coercion, I looked at her steadily. The words she would never hear me speak aloud, the strategy forming in my mind, the revenge carefully planned, remained unspoken but palpable. My smile, small and controlled, became a signal to myself. Patience and precision over impulsive anger. I excused myself briefly under the guise of needing fresh air. The terrace doors opened to a warm Texas evening, the city lights of Houston twinkling faintly in the distance. I inhaled deeply, grounding myself. The cool breeze carried away the stifling air of expectation, if only for a moment. I reviewed my mental checklist, aligning evidence with intention. By the time I returned inside, the first round of speeches would begin, and my plan would already be quietly in motion. Back inside, I observed the guests reacting to the opening toast, unaware of the tempest brewing behind my calm facade. Celine smiled radiantly, oblivious to the fact that the very foundation of her perceived triumph was built upon my compliance. I let the smallest twitch of amusement cross my lips. Even unnoticed, it reminded me of my advantage. And then, as my parents leaned in again, urging me to verbalize agreement, I allowed my gaze to sweep over the room once more. Every smirk, every polite nod, every whispered question was catalogued, every slight a note in the symphony of retribution I would conduct. I felt the thrill of controlled anticipation, the simmering rage carefully harnessed. Tonight was far from over. The so-called gift they presented me had ignited a spark that would not be extinguished by fear or politeness. I would move carefully, thoughtfully, and with intent. Every secret they buried, every manipulation they orchestrated, would eventually be exposed in a crescendo of consequences that they could not ignore. And so I smiled faintly, my expression unreadable but electric with the promise of revelation, as my parents leaned closer, expecting obedience. Little did they know that in the quietest corners of my mind, a storm was already forming, precise, deliberate, and inevitable. My name is Chloe, and I already know that tonight, nothing will go as expected. The terrace doors closed behind me with a soft click, shutting out the warm buzz of voices and laughter. And yet, the weight of the night pressed against me like an invisible force. The Houston skyline stretched beyond the glass, city lights flickering like distant promises I wasn't ready to trust. I leaned against the railing, taking a deep breath, letting the cool evening air brush against my skin. In that moment, I allowed myself to remember. I remembered past birthdays, each one carefully constructed by my parents to showcase Celine's accomplishments while minimizing mine. I was there, a silent contributor, yet somehow my efforts evaporated into the background. The school science fair where I had designed the winning project that everyone praised as Celine's initiative. The volunteer work I organized, celebrated as her generosity. Even simple things, a carefully arranged family dinner I had orchestrated, received no acknowledgement. My contributions were erased, rewritten as if I had been invisible. The memory was bitter, but it fueled a quiet determination. Each slight, each erased accomplishment had become a pattern I could now recognize. And tonight, in this house where glittering surfaces concealed sharp edges, I intended to take notes, catalog every nuance, every misstep, every unguarded glance or slip of the tongue. Moving back inside, I positioned myself in the lounge area where the ambient lighting softened the room, a strategic vantage point to observe. I watched my parents converse with guests, their smiles perfect yet hollow. Celine lingered nearby, feigning interest in conversations while subtly redirecting attention toward herself. The interactions were a dance I knew well. Microaggressions slipped between polite laughter, subtle insinuations hidden beneath compliments. One guest murmured, "It's remarkable how much they've achieved," and my ears perked up. The emphasis was unmistakable. Celine was praised for initiatives that I had actually orchestrated. Twist S3, the subtle, lingering evidence of past betrayals, coalesced in my mind. I walked slowly toward the corner where a small display of family photos was arranged. Each frame captured moments carefully curated, memories frozen, manipulated to suit the narrative my parents preferred. I traced my fingers over a photograph of Celine receiving an award that, in truth, I had labored behind the scenes to secure. The juxtaposition of smiles and invisible effort, of recognition and omission, tightened a knot in my chest. My pulse quickened, yet my expression remained calm, composed, the mask of civility firmly in place. In the midst of this observation, a comment from an older family friend drifted toward me. "You know, Chloe, your parents always manage these finances so cleverly it's impressive how everything seems to work out for Celine." I froze for a heartbeat. The slip wasn't intentional, it was inadvertent, but it confirmed suspicions I had been forming for years: systemic manipulation and carefully concealed inequalities. Twist S4, unwitting confirmation of hidden schemes, expanded in my mind like a map revealing unseen pathways. My frustration simmered, yet I absorbed the information silently, storing it for strategic use later. I retreated to a quieter corner, a small seating area near the sliding doors that led back to the terrace. There, I could take stock, connect dots, plan. My mental checklist began to grow. Contracts, prior promises, financial arrangements, hidden correspondence. Each piece would be a lever for leverage when the time was right. I considered the subtle verbal cues I could issue, the measured questions I could ask guests to further expose truths without revealing my hand. My calm exterior was deliberate, a shield and a strategy. As I sipped a glass of sparkling water, my thoughts returned to the moral anchor that had kept me steady so far: Jackson. I checked my phone discreetly and saw a brief message: "Stay patient. I've got eyes on the documents you need. Tonight, you're not alone." My chest lifted slightly. This Mo Neo Hai Vong, this tether to support, was a reminder that I had allies, people who recognized my value, my rights, my intellect. It gave me courage to act subtly, yet decisively. I let my gaze drift toward Celine. She laughed lightly at a joke, the attention of several guests captured entirely by her charm. Yet, in her smile, I detected something she had not noticed, the faint, deliberate observation from me. The calculation behind my eyes. I would not be so easily redirected, nor would my efforts be stolen unnoticed. The scales of recognition would be balanced, but on my terms. A pause in conversation allowed me to approach my parents under the guise of casual engagement. "Mother, have you seen the ledger from last month?" I asked softly, pointing toward the decorative tray, where papers were scattered. Her smile faltered slightly, the first crack in the polished facade. She replaced the papers hastily, nodding with forced composure. I noted this small shift carefully. It was not yet leverage, but it was proof that cracks existed, that the facade could be tested. I shifted back toward the terrace, letting the cool night air wash over me once more. The lights of Houston stretched below like a river of gold, indifferent to family dramas, yet illuminating the path I would navigate tonight. I reviewed my strategies silently, layering contingency upon contingency. If challenged openly, I would respond with precision and restraint, guiding the family and guests to conclusions they were unprepared for. If silent, I would allow actions to speak, letting the accumulation of evidence render the truth undeniable. A soft vibration on my phone reminded me of another message from Jackson. "They've underestimated you, Chloe. Keep your cool. They'll show their hand soon." I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. Tonight was not about confrontation, not yet. It was about observation, preparation, and the first placement of strategic markers. Every glance, every conversation, every offhand comment from the family or guests was dated to be stored and recalled at the exact moment when I could strike with precision. As I traced the path from the terrace back to the lounge, I encountered my reflection in a mirror, a young woman standing tall, composed, and resolute. The eyes looking back at me were steady, intelligent, and determined. Not the submissive adopted daughter they assumed, not the quiet background presence everyone mistook for compliance, but Chloe, the strategist, the observer, the quietly unyielding force who had endured years of subtle erasure and humiliation. I straightened my shoulders, letting the cool clarity of my intent settle in. Twist S4 would come to fruition tonight, just as S3 had already whispered its warning through the echoes of the past. And as I positioned myself near the gathering once more, listening to laughter, noting whispered tones, I recognized the first opportunities for subtle verbal assertions. A careful question here, a pointed remark there, signals of awareness that would unsettle even the most assured of my family. Freeze, calculate, assert. My internal mantra carried me forward. The evening deepened, the party continuing around me like a living tableau, each guest oblivious to the mental chess game I conducted silently. My parents believed in my compliance. Celine believed in her untouchable advantage. Neither realized that the true game had begun, and I, Chloe, was already several moves ahead. A message beeped again on my phone. "Jackson, the night's just started. Stay close to the terrace for now." My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with anticipation. The hidden currents of deceit, the subtle manipulations, the long-erased contributions, all were on the verge of being leveraged. I adjusted my dress slightly, moved toward the quieter lounge, and allowed my eyes to survey the room one last time before stepping into the center of the social scene again. Tonight, I would not act rashly, but the undercurrent of controlled defiance had begun. And when the time came, everything hidden would rise to the surface. The message glowed in my hand, and for the first time tonight, I felt a spark of control. I pocketed my phone, letting its warmth remind me that I wasn't entirely alone in this carefully constructed circus. I moved toward the private balcony that overlooked the city, the distant lights of Houston blurring into a golden haze. The chatter from the dining room below floated up, a soundtrack to my thoughts as I traced the events of the evening. The party had been designed to celebrate my birthday, yet every element, The champagne glasses gleaming under the soft chandeliers, the meticulously curated playlists, the flattering lighting, had become a mask for the subtle warfare I now recognized. I leaned against the balcony railing, feeling the evening breeze lift stray strands of my hair, my mind dissecting every interaction since I had arrived. The earlier moments, the veiled comments, the polite but pointed suggestions about my role in the family, the gentle nudges toward compliance, had been carefully calculated. Twist S5 had already played its part, a casual remark from my father about how everyone in the family contributed differently, followed by a pointed glance at Celine, insinuating that my own presence was more ornamental than purposeful. The sting was subtle, almost laughable to an outsider, but it was the kind of humiliation designed to erode confidence quietly. I felt the familiar rush of irritation, tempered immediately by a steadying breath. Anger would serve only if wielded precisely. Back inside, I drifted through the lounge toward the dining area, letting the flow of guests mask my movements. My eyes flitted from one face to another, allies who smiled warmly, unaware of the undercurrents, and adversaries whose polite masks barely concealed contempt. I made mental notes, cataloging each nuance of interaction. Who laughed at which joke, whose compliments rang hollow, whose gaze lingered with a subtle challenge. Every detail, no matter how minor, was potential leverage. I paused near the dessert table, where delicate pastries glistened under the soft lighting, and I allowed my gaze to linger briefly on the documents my father had carelessly left on a sideboard. Contracts, letters, promises, artifacts of obligations that had been ignored or manipulated over the years. Twist S6 formed itself in my mind, a deflection, a small, controlled act of rebellion. When my mother approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, suggesting once more that I agree to the surrogate plan for Celine, I met her gaze evenly. "I think it's worth discussing all aspects first," I said calmly, letting the firmness in my tone underline the subtle refusal. Her lips pressed into a thin line. A flicker of surprise passed over her face, mirrored by Celine's raised eyebrows. They hadn't expected resistance, not tonight, not so quietly but resolutely delivered. A guest, unaware of the tension, made a comment about family finances, inadvertently confirming another layer of hidden inequality that had gone unspoken. I smiled politely, pretending to sip my water, but my mind cataloged everything. Every word, every glance, every implied expectation was being stored for later deployment. I noted the precise phrasing, the subtle hesitations, the inconsistencies, each a thread I could pull when the time was right. The party's music shifted, a gentle transition to softer melodies, and I excused myself to the balcony again, needing space to think. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of night-blooming jasmine from the garden below. I allowed myself a moment of private reflection. Years of being overlooked, of having my contributions erased, had not dulled my understanding of these dynamics. I was fully aware now of the game, and I would play it better than anyone expected. My MO Neo Haivong, Jackson, remained a stabilizing presence. Even in his physical absence, the knowledge of his support lent me strength. I traced the lines of the balcony railing with my fingers, letting my mind run through possible maneuvers. Who could be questioned subtly, without raising suspicion? Which documents could be referenced to quietly assert my rights? Every interaction became a potential chess move. The glow from my phone reminded me again. Allies existed, opportunities were unfolding, and the time for precise action was approaching. A voice from inside drew my attention. My father, casually loud enough for those nearby to hear, remarked, "Chloe has always been generous in ways we sometimes overlook." Polite laughter followed. On the surface, it sounded complimentary, yet the words dripped with the familiar undertone of obligation and expectation. I felt the controlled surge of fury that always accompanied such remarks, but I smiled faintly, keeping my tone neutral as I answered, "I suppose generosity comes in many forms, doesn't it?" The subtle deflection carried weight, a signal that I was neither naive nor pliable. Guests exchanged brief, curious glances, sensing the undercurrent of tension without fully understanding it. Returning to the indoor dining room, I maneuvered near the staircase that led to the balcony, where I could observe the guests' interactions while maintaining my own composure. I noted the placement of certain key family members, how Celine was attempting to monopolize attention, how my parents unconsciously deferred to her suggestions, and how a few guests whispered speculations I was eager to confirm. Each piece was a puzzle, and I was beginning to see the pattern, a complex web of favoritism, expectation, and hidden agreements. I allowed myself a small, private smirk. Twist S6 had been set, and though no one realized it yet, the first act of my silent rebellion had occurred. It was a statement of intent, and it had the subtlety required to keep them unaware of the magnitude of my resolve. I continued to catalog, to observe, to prepare. From the corner of the room, I noticed a slightly ajar door leading to a private study. Documents I had glimpsed earlier were within reach, but tonight was about observation and quiet placement of strategy, not confrontation. I stepped closer, pretending to admire a floral arrangement, and let my gaze wander over the papers just long enough to reaffirm their presence. In my mind, I began mapping out the sequence for later exposure. Contracts, letters, notes from years past, all waiting to be leveraged at the optimal moment. The city's glow through the large dining room windows reminded me that I was not a passive participant. I had agency. Each calculated observation, each carefully measured word, each discreet notation would culminate in a cascade of revelation. I could feel the tension rising, the stakes heightening with every interaction. A soft vibration alerted me to another message from Jackson. Watch the conversation near the dessert table. Opportunity coming. My heart lifted slightly with anticipation. Tonight, the game had only begun, and already I was several moves ahead, positioning myself for the tipping point that would challenge every assumption they had made about me. I exhaled slowly, letting the cool indoor air mix with the soft fragrance of the candles lining the dining table. My internal mantra repeated: observe, document, assert, and wait. The first true tests of their reactions had passed, and the quiet rebellion had been noted. Now, the subtle manipulations, the veiled comments, the unspoken expectations, they would all become visible under my calculated gaze. Every conversation, every shared laugh, every passing glance carried significance. I tracked each micro-expression, each hesitation, and each carefully crafted lie. I would not act hastily, yet every moment brought me closer to the point where the carefully hidden truths would surface. The dinner service began, the gentle clinking of silverware and quiet conversations forming a background rhythm to my thoughts. I remained poised, calculating, noting where I could press, where I could expose, and where patience was required. Tonight, no one would leave unexamined, no opportunity for leverage would be overlooked, and no slight would go unanswered in its proper time. The words I overheard made my pulse quicken. Tonight, the game had already begun. I took a deep breath, centering myself as I stepped into the living room, where the low hum of conversation mixed with the soft glow of lamps and the occasional clink of crystal. The air was heavy with polite smiles and veiled tension, and I could feel it pressing against my skin like an invisible weight. Every gesture, every laugh, every tilt of a head had meaning tonight, and I intended to interpret each one with precision. I moved deliberately past the gathering of relatives, careful to observe rather than engage, yet leaving my presence unmistakable. My parents, seated near the far end of the room, exchanged glances that were more subtle than overt, their expressions carrying the faintest traces of expectation and judgment. The biological daughter, Celine, lounged elegantly on the couch, her posture deliberate, as though she owned every inch of the space. The soft flicker of the fireplace cast long shadows that seemed to exaggerate their gestures, and I made a silent note of how those shadows reflected the power and balance that had defined my childhood. The first real act of assertion came as a quiet verbal probe. Twist S7. My father's casual mention of my obligation hung in the air, almost imperceptible to anyone else. I allowed a beat to pass, measuring the room, feeling every eye on us, without anyone realizing my internal calculation. Then I responded, soft but unmistakably firm. Obligation is a choice, Dad. I'm choosing to understand the consequences before I act. The words were simple, but they carried weight. For the first time in years, I felt the tremor of surprise ripple across their faces. Their careful composure cracked, if only for a moment, revealing the undercurrent of their expectations. I drifted toward the home office, a space my parents often considered a sanctuary from the casual chaos of social interaction. Here, surrounded by books and framed accolades, I began leaving subtle traces of evidence. Twist S8, small revelations placed strategically, notes tucked into folders, photographs left casually in plain sight, digital reminders quietly scheduled on shared devices. Each item, innocuous to the untrained eye, was a carefully crafted breadcrumb that, when followed, would map the pattern of favoritism, manipulation, and deception that had shaped my experience in this family. I paused to reflect, resting my hand on the edge of a polished oak desk. My mind traced the familiar sequence of betrayals, forgotten birthdays, unacknowledged school achievements, quiet dismissals that had, over time, stitched a pattern of invisibility. Each memory was a stitch in the fabric of my resolve, reinforcing why tonight could not pass without action. It was not merely about asserting myself. It was about reclaiming the narrative that had been denied to me for 18 years. A subtle gesture toward my mother, a measured glance, a tilt of my head, was all it took to communicate a silent warning. She noticed, her lips pressing into a thin line. The message was clear. I was aware, I was prepared, and I would not be moved without deliberation. There was no yelling, no dramatic scene, only the quiet assertion of boundaries. I had learned that the most effective power often manifests in restraint. I moved back toward the living room, letting my observations continue with deliberate patience. Guests chatted unknowingly around me, their comments and laughter filling the space as I cataloged every micro-expression, every slight inflection, every subtle nod of agreement or disapproval. The patterns were emerging, and I traced the invisible lines of influence and expectation, mentally connecting each node of manipulation to the next. Then my phone vibrated softly in my pocket. A message from my ally, the MO Neo Hai Vong, confirming a small but significant support system in place. A quiet ally who would back me when the time came to escalate. That tiny spark of confirmation lit a steady flame of resolve. I allowed a small, private smile. I was not alone, and this network, however subtle, would be crucial for the next stages of the plan. I returned briefly to the study, reviewing the documents I had earlier noted. Contracts that ignored my rights, letters that twisted obligations, subtle financial manipulations. All these artifacts of control would, in due course, serve as instruments to reclaim my autonomy. But timing was everything. Any premature action could provoke defensiveness rather than revelation. I let the documents remain, leaving only a hint of my awareness in strategic placements. A soft murmur from the living room drew me back. My parents discussed arrangements for future gatherings, carefully omitting any acknowledgement of my contributions or voice. I caught a slip, an inadvertent confirmation of a hidden clause in a contract, and my pulse quickened. Every detail mattered. Every error was a key, and I filed it away, a mental note ready to be exploited at the right moment. Returning to the lounge, I made small, deliberate interventions. A brief, pointed question here, a comment designed to expose an inconsistency there. Each was measured, subtle, almost imperceptible to casual observers, yet unmistakable to those attuned to the rhythm of family dynamics. The balance was delicate, enough to signal awareness, not so much as to trigger defensive overreaction. The evening air softened as dusk gave way to night, and the city lights outside blurred into a warm glow through the wide windows. I allowed myself a moment to savor the quiet thrill of strategy, of the silent warning shots that had been fired. My parents, still unaware of the depth of my awareness, moved through their routines, their gestures increasingly cautious under the subtle pressure I applied. Finally, a small note appeared on my side table, cryptic yet confirming part of my suspicions. Twist S8 fully manifested. The paper hinted at undisclosed assets and potential leverage points, confirming that the quiet network I was cultivating could indeed tip the scales when the time came. I held it carefully, feeling a controlled excitement, a recognition that the groundwork had been laid for the escalation to follow. Tonight, I had sent my first signals, planted my subtle markers, and quietly reclaimed a fraction of the power that had been denied to me. The family remained oblivious to the precision of my moves, and that ignorance was my greatest advantage. I felt the calm clarity that comes from knowing one's path, even amid uncertainty and latent danger. Each step, each observation, each strategic placement had been deliberate, and the game, now fully in motion, promised the tipping point I had been building toward for years. The note was brief, but its implications were vast. I knew I had to move carefully, yet decisively. I paused at the threshold of the dining room, letting the low murmur of conversation wash over me while I collected my thoughts. Tonight, subtlety was no longer sufficient. Every word, every movement, every glance would carry weight. I could feel the anticipation vibrating through the air, and I allowed myself a slow inhale, letting the warmth of the house blend with the coolness of my resolve. The dining room was elegant, familiar, yet tonight it felt charged, almost like the stage of a play I had long anticipated but never rehearsed for. The soft lighting highlighted the polished wood of the table, the delicate china carefully arranged for dinner, and the ambient sounds of the city through the large bay windows. I could hear the faint laughter of my parents and Celine, each chuckle tinged with the subtle superiority that had always made me a shadow in this family. I approached, my footsteps quiet, deliberate, aware that I was stepping into a battlefield where words alone could disarm or wound. I set my bag down by a side chair, casually checking that my phone was muted, though my mind buzzed with calculations. Twist S9 loomed ahead. Tonight I would speak. Not with anger, not with theatrics, but with precision, exposing the unfairness I had endured. Mom, Dad, I began, my voice steady but carrying a calm authority. I need to clarify my position regarding the expectation placed on me. I am not here to fulfill obligations that compromise my autonomy or identity. I paused to let the weight of my statement settle, noting the subtle shift in their posture, the quickening glance exchanged between them. They were silent for a moment, the kind of silence heavy with realization, yet edged with disbelief that I would dare articulate the obvious. I continued, allowing each word to land with care. I have contributed to this family, supported each member in ways that are often unrecognized. Assigning me the role of surrogate for Celine is not a request. It is an imposition, and I will not comply without full acknowledgement and voluntary consent. The tension in the room thickened. My words were soft, almost conversational, yet their precision made the underlying authority impossible to ignore. I noticed the flicker of unease in Celine's eyes, a subtle tightening of her jaw as she realized this quiet rebellion was far more deliberate than anything she had witnessed before. She had always assumed I would acquiesce, as I had in the past, slipping silently into the background. But this was different. This was the moment where passive endurance transformed into active agency. I allowed a momentary pause, letting the conversation's current carry me toward Twist S10. I retrieved a small folder from my bag, a collection of carefully organized notes and documents that corroborated my claims, prior communications, overlooked contributions, and subtle financial discrepancies. I did not thrust them into their faces. Instead, I left the folder open on the edge of the table, angled so that any glance would reveal its contents. A trusted ally, my moral anchor throughout this ordeal, appeared subtly in the room, a cousin who had always observed the family dynamics with a neutral eye. Their quiet presence reinforced my courage. They did not speak, but their nod and discreet glance assured me that the path I had chosen, though risky, was fortified by silent support. I gestured lightly toward the folder, letting the implication settle. There are details here you may wish to review before proceeding. I trust we can discuss this with the transparency and respect that should have existed all along. The words were calm, yet every syllable carried the weight of intention. This micro-exposure was carefully controlled. It revealed just enough to signal awareness without laying bare my entire hand. The room stilled further, the guests sensing an invisible shift in the dynamic. Even the house itself seemed to pause, the soft hum of air conditioning and distant traffic falling away as the quiet assertion took hold. My parents exchanged subtle glances, calculating their next steps. For the first time, they confronted a daughter who would not be moved by gentle nudges or the pretense of obligation. I felt the surge of control, tempered by caution. The balance had shifted. Where before I had been a shadow, now I was a pivot point, a fulcrum on which the family's dynamics teetered. Yet I reminded myself that the next moves required strategy, patience, and relentless observation. I was not seeking revenge for its own sake. I sought justice, acknowledgement, and the restoration of my voice. I continued, reinforcing boundaries without aggression. Moving forward, any expectation of compliance must be discussed openly and respectfully. I will not be placed in a position where my personal choice is ignored or trivialized. My tone remained calm, deliberate, measured, but the clarity and firmness made retreat impossible. I had articulated consequences not as threats, but as inevitable outcomes of continued disregard for my autonomy. The evening progressed, with small interactions that seemed innocuous, but were laden with subtext. Every smile, every comment, every polite murmur from the guests was weighed, analyzed, and catalogued. I left nothing to chance. Each interaction was an opportunity to gather insight, a piece of the puzzle that would allow me to anticipate the next move in this ongoing family chess game. Twilight deepened outside, casting a soft orange glow through the dining room windows, and I felt the subtle power of momentum. The groundwork for larger exposure was being laid tonight. The seeds of quiet defiance had been planted, and already, the smallest gestures of resistance on my part were rippling through the family structure. Then, as I refilled my glass with water, I noticed a small, almost imperceptible gesture from my father. A tightening of the jaw, a half-step backward, an unspoken acknowledgement that he recognized the shift. This indirect threat, the subtle assertion of continued control on their part, only reinforced my conviction. I would not retreat. I would stand my ground. They thought my silence would keep me in line, but I was ready for the next move, and they had no idea what was coming. The subtle shift I had created in the air was palpable, almost like electricity coursing through the familiar walls of the living room. Every detail mattered tonight. The clink of a glass, the soft shuffle of feet across the rug, the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. I lingered at the edge of the room for a moment, letting the tension build as I drew a quiet, steadying breath. My mind replayed each calculated step I had taken over the past weeks, the careful gathering of evidence, the small, almost imperceptible nudges that hinted I was no longer the quiet, compliant daughter. I moved toward the home office first, the place where most family business had been quietly conducted without me. My footsteps were soft, almost ghost-like on the polished hardwood. I paused at the doorway, observing my parents in mid-conversation, their expressions tight, measured. Subtle irritation flashed in their eyes when they noticed me standing there, unannounced but fully present. Every interaction over the past months had prepared me for this. The silences, the forced smiles, the tiny microaggressions designed to make me shrink into the background. Tonight, I would turn those moments into leverage. Twist S11 had been simmering in my mind for weeks. I retrieved a carefully organized set of documents from my bag, the fruit of meticulous research, ledgers, past statements, and subtle notations that clearly demonstrated the financial favoritism poured toward Celine. I placed them strategically on the office desk, angled so they could be glimpsed from the living room, knowing full well my parents' eyes would catch the proof. The air shifted immediately, almost imperceptibly, as they noticed the first hint of exposure. I remained calm, giving nothing away with my posture or expression, letting the evidence speak silently, yet powerfully. I started with a measured comment, almost casual in tone. Funny how some contributions seem to go unnoticed, yet others are highlighted endlessly. I've kept my own records. Perhaps it's time someone else took a look. The subtlety of my words was deliberate, a provocation that required them to respond without forcing my hand. Their eyes widened slightly, an unspoken acknowledgement that I had begun to dismantle the narrative they had carefully crafted over the years. Even as my pulse quickened, I maintained the composure that had taken months to perfect. Twist S12 loomed ahead. A few well-chosen excerpts from emails and private notes were discreetly shared with select extended family members who were already uneasy about the dynamics at home. The information wasn't complete, yet it was enough to create a ripple effect, a slow burn of social pressure that hinted at the truths I had long kept to myself. I watched carefully as subtle expressions of concern flickered across familiar faces, noting their body language, their restrained murmurs, the way they exchanged glances that betrayed unease. The living room seemed to hold its breath. Every glance I cast was deliberate, every measured pause a signal. My adoptive parents, accustomed to unquestioned authority, were beginning to show cracks in their composure. I could see the micro-expressions, the flickers of irritation and doubt, that told me my strategy was working. This was no longer a matter of whispered resentments behind closed doors. It was becoming public, undeniable, and meticulously controlled. I let myself a brief internal smile, a small acknowledgement of the quiet triumph. Yet I reminded myself this was merely the setup for the real confrontation. The documents, the subtle provocations, the whispers to allies, they were all pieces of a puzzle that would culminate in a decisive exposure. My Mo Neo Haivong, the trusted ally who had been quietly observing alongside me, offered a subtle nod from the corner. Their presence was a steadying force, a reminder that I was not alone in this effort and that my moves were measured, not reckless. I returned to the living room with a calm composure, engaging in light conversation with guests while keeping mental tabs on every subtle gesture and tone. Every smile, every laugh, every soft glance carried potential information, a cue that would help me anticipate their next attempt at manipulation. By now, I could sense the tension thickening. My parents' usual control was slipping, replaced by cautious calculation and mild panic. Each interaction was a chess move, and I was 3 steps ahead. Twist S12 unfolded gradually. A whispered remark, an inadvertent slip from a visiting relative, hinted at deeper favoritism and manipulation within the family finances. My parents' discomfort was almost tangible. I allowed the comment to sink in, masking my satisfaction with a neutral smile while noting the exact phrasing and the emotional responses it elicited. This evidence would feed into the next phase, the public escalation that would ultimately challenge their authority in an undeniable way. Even as the family members continued their social interactions, I quietly mapped contingencies. Should my parents attempt to redirect attention, I had prepared responses, documented evidence, and subtle social cues that would keep the pressure steady without revealing the full scope of my strategy. The game was advancing. The moves were deliberate, calculated, and controlled. I was both player and orchestrator, turning prior injustices into leverage while maintaining moral and strategic superiority. The evening deepened into night, casting the city lights into the room in muted reflections. Shadows stretched across the polished surfaces, mirroring the subtle tension that had settled over the household. Every word I had spoken, every document I had revealed, every whisper sent to allies had planted seeds of unease that would blossom into confrontation. I could feel it, the moment when my passive endurance would transform fully into active retaliation was approaching. The groundwork had been laid meticulously, and the ripple effects were undeniable. Finally, a small, almost imperceptible gesture from my father, a clenching of the jaw, a hand brushing over the desk, an almost imperceptible tightening of the shoulders, told me that he recognized the shift. They were beginning to understand that I was no longer the pliable daughter they could direct at will. Yet they still underestimated the full extent of my preparedness. The final moves were ready, the crescendo imminent, and I allowed myself a quiet satisfaction at the precise orchestration of every step up to this point. They thought they had me cornered, but I was already 3 moves ahead, and the final play was coming. I stepped lightly into the center of the room, feeling the subtle tension curl around me like smoke. The lights of the evening shimmered off crystal glasses and polished furniture, reflecting the careful orchestration of my surroundings. My mind replayed every measured step I had taken, the strategic placement of documents, the whispered revelations to key allies, the deliberate pauses in conversation that forced attention. Tonight, it would all converge, and there would be no escaping the truth. The room felt unusually quiet, almost anticipatory. Guests mingled at the edges, chatting in small groups, but their eyes kept drifting toward me. Every glance, every slight shift of posture, told me that the subtle power dynamics were now in motion. I took a deep breath, letting my calm exterior mask the racing calculations beneath. For years, I had been the quiet observer, the youngest, the overlooked. Tonight, I would turn that invisibility into an instrument of revelation. I began by positioning the materials I had meticulously curated, contracts, emails, photographs, in plain view on the ornate dining table. Each item was strategically angled, ensuring that anyone walking past would notice them. My parents, expecting compliance, exchanged subtle glances that betrayed both curiosity and unease. The first murmurs of awareness fluttered through the room like a hesitant wind. Twist S13 was ready. I spoke then, softly, deliberately, yet with unwavering authority. "It's fascinating," I began, allowing my voice to draw attention without raising it, "how certain expectations have been communicated in private, yet no one ever questions them in public. Tonight, I think it's time we look at the facts, clearly, indisputably." I gestured toward the documents with the smallest movement of my hand. Heads turned, and the air thickened with unspoken tension. As I spoke, I recounted carefully selected incidents from my teenage years, each memory delivered with calm precision. The subtle neglect at school events, the credit for achievements being redirected to Celine, the thinly veiled coercion at family gatherings, all were pieces of a puzzle I had kept hidden until now. The guests, initially polite, now began connecting dots that my parents had assumed were invisible. Their smiles froze, small murmurs replaced polite conversation, and my words carried weight far beyond their mere content. The adoptive parents attempted to interject, to redirect the narrative with practiced charm and feigned concern. Twist S14 unfolded naturally. Their efforts to manipulate backfired, their voices faltering, their credibility cracking under the mounting evidence. Peers and family members shifted in their seats, eyes narrowing, whispers passing, questions forming. The meticulous construction of my prior actions, the documents placed, the subtle hints delivered, the evidence of favoritism, ensured there was no room for denial. I allowed silence to become my ally. Each pause, each deliberate breath, amplified the impact of my revelations. I didn't need to shout or dramatize. The truth itself commanded attention. Guests leaned in, drawn by the tension, by the sense of watching an inevitability unfold. My calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the flickers of panic and frustration now visible on the faces of my adoptive parents. It was, for them, a lesson in precision. They had underestimated the youngest daughter once too often. Subtle gestures punctuated my statements. A pointed glance, a slow adjustment of documents, a measured nod toward an ally. Each action underscored my control and reinforced the narrative. The room, now fully attentive, became a theater of exposure, every guest a witness to the unraveling of a carefully maintained facade. The ripple effects of the evening's revelations were already spreading. Whispered conversations between extended family members and friends began forming, highlighting inconsistencies and hidden manipulations. My parents' authority, once unchallenged, was now openly questioned. Through it all, I kept my mental map active. Every reaction, every shift in body language, every subtle intake of breath was catalogued and stored for the final phase. I noted alliances forming, skepticism spreading, and unease radiating through those who had once been complicit by silence. My MO Neo Hai Vong remained discreetly supportive, their presence reinforcing my confidence without attracting undue attention. Time seemed to stretch, elongated by the weight of scrutiny. I allowed each revelation to settle fully before proceeding, letting the collective tension peak naturally. The documents, the whispered corroborations, and my calm, strategic delivery coalesced into an atmosphere where the truth was undeniable. No one could dismiss the patterns, the favoritism, the coercion, or the hidden manipulations. The social foundation that had protected my adoptive parents for years was beginning to crumble. As the evening edged toward night, I took a brief step back, allowing space for reflection and for the impact to resonate. My parents exchanged hurried, hushed words, their previous confidence now replaced with a subtle panic. I observed without speaking, letting the room process, letting the network of witnesses understand the depth of what had been hidden for so long. Finally, I left the room for a moment, walking to the terrace where the cool Houston night air brushed my skin. From this vantage point, I could watch the scene unfold without interference, a silent observer of the consequences of meticulous planning. The final pieces of the puzzle were set. The next chapter of confrontation would be irreversible. I stepped back into the room, feeling the weight of every secret I had collected, knowing tonight would end differently. The dim lighting of the estate seemed sharper somehow, each glint from crystal chandeliers reflecting the careful orchestration of my strategy. The evening air carried a chill, but inside, the tension was palpable. Every person in the room, every whispered exchange, every subtle glance, now felt as though it were a part of the intricate web I had patiently woven. I could sense the moment approaching, the pivot from observation to exposure, from silent resistance to undeniable authority. The first step was precise. I arranged the documents, photographs, and carefully documented messages into an organized display on the mahogany table in the family study. Each folder, each item, was labeled and positioned so that anyone who approached could not miss them. The timing had been calculated. The guests were at the peak of attention, the adoptive parents were distracted by the social choreography they assumed they controlled, and my trusted ally, my MO Neo Hai Vong, was positioned to signal discreet support at the right moment. Everything was in place for Twist S15. I began to speak, deliberately pacing my words, each one carefully measured for maximum clarity and impact. For years, I said softly, letting the room absorb the weight of my tone, I have been expected to step into roles that were never mine to fill, to bend and mold myself into the image this family demanded. Tonight, it is no longer about expectation. It is about truth. My gaze swept across the room, noting the stiffening posture of my adoptive parents, the subtle tightening of lips, the barely perceptible furrow of brows. Then, with a measured flourish, I opened one folder, revealing financial records, emails, and personal notes that meticulously demonstrated favoritism toward the biological daughter and the concealed manipulations I had endured. Twist S15 unfolded naturally. The documents spoke for themselves. My parents' attempts to smile, to offer excuses, faltered under the undeniable evidence. The audience, extended family, close friends, and other guests, shifted uncomfortably as realization settled in. Whispers spread rapidly, questioning, connecting dots, validating what had long been ignored. I did not raise my voice. I did not flail my hands. Instead, I allowed each revelation to resonate, each pause to punctuate the severity of the evidence. My composure, deliberate and controlled, amplified the effect. Every subtle gesture, a nod, a measured glance, a step back, magnified the impact of what was before them. This was the precise moment where my silence and restraint converted into power. Every document, every proof of favoritism, every subtle manipulation now radiated authority and credibility. As the initial shock began to ripple through the room, I stepped forward calmly, delivering the declaration that would mark Twist S16. I will not comply with any expectation that violates my autonomy, I said, voice steady, eyes unwavering. No longer will silence be mistaken for consent, and no longer will coercion be hidden behind polite conversation. I am asserting my independence, my dignity, and my right to live free from manipulation. The room held its breath. The impact of the statement was immediate, leaving no ambiguity, no room for negotiation. Social and legal consequences began to cascade almost immediately. My adoptive parents, now visibly shaken, attempted to respond, but their words faltered. The guests' murmurs shifted into open questioning, and allies I had quietly aligned with began validating my narrative with subtle confirmations and small gestures of support. The social structure that had shielded my parents for years was fracturing before my eyes. The power they had assumed was theirs by default was now contested, challenged, and collapsing. I moved with purpose through the room, checking that each piece of evidence was in the right place, each ally aware of their subtle role. The ripple effects were undeniable. Cousins exchanged glances, aunts and uncles whispered confirmations, and friends who had previously hesitated now expressed quiet acknowledgement of the truth. The social isolation of my adoptive parents began to solidify, the first taste of accountability settling in like an unavoidable shadow. In private moments between these orchestrated revelations, I reflected on the years of dismissal, the subtle erasure of my achievements, and the quiet undermining that had defined my early life with this family. I acknowledged the weight of what I had done, not as vengeance, but as reclamation. The careful strategy, the deliberate patience, and the meticulous preparation had brought me to this point. Empowerment through clarity, strength through strategy, and validation through truth. I noticed the signs of the final collapse in my parents, defensive body language, rapid glances at one another, and the almost imperceptible quiver of a hand adjusting a glass. The evidence, the narrative, and my unwavering stance had left them unable to manipulate or redirect. This was the culmination of years of preparation, of patience, and of calculated risk-taking. They had underestimated me at every turn, and now the consequences were undeniable. Finally, as the night deepened, I stepped out onto the terrace, the warm Texas air a stark contrast to the tension inside. Below me, I could see the subtle disarray. Quiet debates, thoughtful nods, and a landscape of fractured authority. For the first time in years, I felt the tangible weight of autonomy, the clear line between manipulation and independence, the sharp relief of having my voice heard and respected. But even in victory, I knew the journey of healing was just beginning. The estate lay quiet under the glow of outdoor lamps, shadows long and soft, while inside, my adoptive parents faced the undeniable consequences of their actions. I breathed in the evening air, sensing the mixture of relief and lingering tension. The truth had been unveiled, the power dynamics reversed, yet my own recovery and emotional equilibrium were still works in progress. The night had been won, but the internal battles, the reconstruction of self and identity, were only beginning. The house was quiet, but my mind replayed every moment, every betrayal, every hard-won truth. The soft hum of the ceiling fan in my room seemed almost to echo the quiet intensity that had settled over the household in the aftermath of the climactic confrontation. The week had passed in a blur, phone calls, legal consultations, subtle shifts in family dynamics, but finally, I could breathe in the stillness of my personal space. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I unfolded the journal I had begun keeping months ago, a repository of memories, insights, and quiet strategies. Each page felt heavier tonight, filled with lessons learned and confirmations that every careful move I had made mattered. The first mornings after the events were surreal. Walking through the familiar hallways of the house, I noticed the absence of the usual tension, replaced instead by an awkward silence that stretched thickly across the rooms. My adoptive parents had begun to retreat from the social circles that once supported their influence. Invitations they previously extended were unanswered. Subtle exchanges with neighbors now carried hesitation and polite avoidance. Even casual acquaintances, once eager to gossip or align with the family hierarchy, seemed to tread lightly around them. Their authority, painstakingly maintained for decades, had been undone in a matter of nights. In these quiet days, I reflected deeply on my own journey. There were lingering moments of doubt, occasional pangs recalling years of dismissal, the feeling of being invisible or underestimated, but these were tempered by a newfound clarity. I recognized patterns that had governed my upbringing, subtle manipulations, erased contributions, constant reminders that I was the youngest, the adopted, the one whose desires were secondary. Yet, the same clarity that revealed these injustices also illuminated the path forward. Every record of favoritism, every whispered slight, had been catalogued in my mind and my journal, ready to inform decisions I would make for myself. I began reclaiming autonomy in practical ways. Small daily rituals, the selection of my own meals, the control over my schedule, the choice of who I interacted with, became acts of empowerment. More significant steps followed, enrolling in classes I had long desired to pursue, establishing boundaries that could not be ignored, and reconnecting with friends who had supported me quietly over the years. Each action reinforced my identity beyond the roles that had been imposed on me, and each was a testament to the hard-won respect I now claimed for myself and others. The social repercussions for my adoptive parents became increasingly visible. Family friends who had once hesitated to confront them now expressed acknowledgement of the truths I had revealed. Extended family members offered subtle gestures of solidarity, small confirmations that my narrative was understood and validated. My parents' attempts to regain social footing often backfired. Missteps in conversation, the unintentional disclosure of prior mismanagement, or the unavoidable tension in rooms where their credibility had been publicly questioned. While they remained in my life, the dynamic had shifted irreversibly. I now held the clear boundary and the moral high ground. Emotionally, the process of healing was neither linear nor immediate. Some nights, I felt the ache of betrayal, a reminder of the years I had endured unnoticed, coerced, or manipulated. I allowed myself to acknowledge these feelings without judgment, treating them as reminders of resilience rather than weakness. I realized that while justice had been served in public, the internal reconciliation with past experiences required patience, reflection, and self-compassion. Journaling became more than documentation. It was a method of processing, a bridge between the pain of the past and the hope of the future. In private moments, I reflected on the lessons learned, the importance of careful observation, strategic patience, and the ability to respond without impulsivity. Each encounter with my adoptive parents had been a lesson in human behavior, power dynamics, and the necessity of mental fortitude. The experience had reinforced my belief in integrity, the value of truth, and the strength inherent in maintaining calm in the face of manipulation. I understood now that confrontation, when guided by clarity and preparation, could transform what once seemed oppressive into an opportunity for empowerment and justice. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the Houston skyline, I placed a small heirloom on my desk, a silver pendant that had belonged to my biological mother, a symbol of personal history and resilience. This act, simple yet profoundly meaningful, was a tangible acknowledgement of the past, a marker of autonomy reclaimed, and a promise to honor my own path. Each time I glanced at it, I felt a grounding connection, a reminder that while the family I had grown into had tried to define me, my identity was now firmly my own. In the ensuing weeks, I noticed subtle but meaningful changes in my relationships with others. Friends and colleagues began consulting me more for advice, recognizing both the wisdom I had cultivated and the calm decisiveness I now embodied. My adoptive parents, while still present in my life, were unable to exercise the undue influence they once held. I felt the equilibrium shift in ways that were both gratifying and cautiously liberating, the delicate balance of personal empowerment interwoven with the ongoing challenge of navigating complex familial ties. Ultimately, I recognized that life's lessons were seldom absolute, and victory, even when achieved, did not erase all consequences or all memories. Some evenings, I allowed myself to walk the grounds of the estate alone, feeling the quiet hum of the city in the distance, reflecting on how the past had shaped my present and how my present would shape my future. The shadows of previous struggles lingered, but they no longer dictated the terms of my life. I had reclaimed control, and that alone was sufficient to guide my steps forward. As I closed the journal for the night, a sense of serene determination settled over me. The chapters of conflict and resolution had concluded publicly, but the ongoing narrative of personal growth and emotional healing remained vibrant and ongoing. I acknowledged that some wounds were slow to fade, that trust once broken required time to rebuild, and that resilience was cultivated daily. Yet, with clarity, integrity, and the unwavering commitment to uphold my boundaries, I felt equipped to navigate the complexities of family, society, and self with renewed confidence. I placed the journal back on the shelf, carefully aligned with the heirloom, symbolizing both remembrance and progress. The quiet of the Houston night wrapped around me as I prepared for sleep, the culmination of battles fought, and the promise of continued growth ahead. In that moment, I understood that victory was not only measured in justice imposed on others, but in the strength, wisdom, and dignity I carried forward. Closing thought, I had finally reclaimed my life. Though the past would always whisper, I now chose what to listen to. Before we close the story, one thing becomes clear. Standing up for yourself, even against those who are meant to protect you, is never selfish. It's necessary. Chloe's journey reminds us that truth, resilience, and courage can dismantle even the deepest betrayals. What would you do if you were in her shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to follow more gripping